Good evening, everyone. I'm Stephen Aaron. I'm the chair of the UCLA History Department, and I'm really pleased to be able to welcome you to this year's Alden-Berg Lecture. And I'll say a little bit more about the Alden-Berg Lecture in a moment and about our Alden-Berg lecturer. First, though, I guess I want to call your attention to a couple of save the dates that we want you to put in your calendar. One is on February 16th. At 7:30 p.m., our next Why History Matters program brings together in a conversation about mayors past, present, and future of Los Angeles, a conversation with Richard Riordan, James Hahn, and Antonio Villaraigosa, talking about their experiences and the histories that they lived and what we can learn from their tenures and what the present and future holds for Los Angeles in that regard. So please, that event is filling up quickly. I think we have something over 750 or 800 RSVPs already for that. So if you're interested, please let us know and put that date on your calendars. Also then looking further ahead, on May 18th, our next Why History Matters has been put together by my predecessor, is chair of the UCLA History Department, David Myers, who's put together a full-day conference, but the Why History Matters piece of it will look at curricular wars about history in Israel and Palestine and in California. And we'll see what comes out of that conversation. That's at May 18th. I believe that one is, again, I'm not sure if it's at 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock yet. We'll make sure that you know that. So mark your calendars. Today, though, we're here to we're happy to host the 6th Alden-Berg Lecture, a lecture that honors two longtime friends of the UCLA History Department, friends Jerry Alden and Barbara Berg, and Barbara is here with us this evening. And I'll ask her to sort of stand and take a little acclamation here. Both Barbara and Jerry, as I said, are longtime friends of the UCLA History Department. Indeed, they are the founders of the Friends of History group that they led for many, many years, bringing vital support to graduate students in the UCLA History Department. But more than that, bringing the UCLA History Department out of Bunch Hall and into the homes of people in Los Angeles, and really bringing, as I say, bringing history into the public realm, something that we've taken as a crucial piece of our mission in the UCLA History Department. You can find out more about the biographies of Jerry and Barbara in the program that you should all have, as well as that of our Alden-Berg lecturer, Ben Madley. But for Barbara and Jerry, I really want to, as I say, celebrate them for their leadership in this department, for their years of opening their homes, for their years of support, for the years in which they put on salon after salon after salon in their homes. And as I said, encouraged us all to move beyond the academy and put our histories out into the public realm, into the public arena. That commitment to making history matter has, I hope, become a signature of the UCLA History Department. And it's so fitting then that the Alden-Berg Lecture, now in its 6th year, contributes vitally to that mission by addressing important issues of the past and connecting these to the present. Yet this evening, as we celebrate the contributions of Jerry Alden and Barbara Berg, we also offer our condolences to Jerry Alden on the loss of her husband, Hal Alden, who passed away on January 7th of this year. We've included in the program the obituary that was published in the Los Angeles Times, which gives a brief account of his life as a husband and father, and I found fascinating, especially as a pioneering businessman who ventured to Japan and China, as the obituary recounts, to imagine a new way of doing business without borders. Of course, in this moment, I can't help wonder if the era of doing business without borders that Hal Alden pioneered is now ending. But that, I guess, will have to be the subject of a future Alden-Berg lecture. Tonight, as I say, we will have Ben Madley, but I would ask those of you who, many of you I think who are in this room were participants in the Friends of History group and in the salon, and I asked Barbara, and with Jerry's approval, if you would like to pay tribute to Hal Alden's memory, if you'd like to honor Hal Alden's memory, we would certainly welcome, and they would welcome contributions to the UCLA Foundation earmarked for either the Alden-Berg Fund or the Friends of History group, both of which, as I say, support department activities. This evening, we have the treat of hearing from Benjamin Madley, whose first book, well, it's right there, I don't have to hold it up for you, but it's a big book, whose first book, An American Genocide, The California Indian Catastrophe, 1846 to 1873, was published several months ago by Yale University Press and has already garnered widespread attention and acclaim, and not a little controversy as well. As I mentioned, the Alden-Berg Lecture, like all of our public programs, sponsored by the UCLA History Department, aims to demonstrate why history matters. And few recent books, as you're about to learn, matter more than Ben Madley's. An American Genocide is not an easy book to read. Not that it's not extremely well written, but it's not an easy book to read because of the painstaking detail with which Madley has reconstructed the California Indian catastrophe. It is not an easy lesson to take in. But it is a history, as I think you'll hear this evening, it is a history with which all of us in California must grapple, as we should all of us anywhere who want to better understand genocides here and elsewhere, and to wrestle with their legacies, to reckon with reparations and reconciliations that we may owe, and to guard against the next catastrophe. Ben Madley.
Thank you, Steve, for that very warm welcome. Before we begin, I'd like to say a few words. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge all of you who have come out this evening to reckon with a very difficult past. For some of you, particularly Native American dignitaries, students, scholars in this room, this material brings to mind and to sensation wounds that are not yet healed, that may still be bleeding. If you need to take a moment to go outside for air, to say a prayer, or just to gather yourself, I welcome you in doing so. If someone needs to get up in the middle of the lecture, please make room for them. Please make it easy for them to go out. The second thing that I want to acknowledge this evening is that we are in Indian country here tonight. We're in California Indian country. Specifically, we are in the ancient homelands here at UCLA of the Tongva people who have lived here for at least 12 or 14,000 years according to Western thought and science, or since time immemorial according to Tongva people. When you leave this room tonight, you will be in Tongva country. Wherever you drive to go home, whether you go into the San Fernando Valley, into Tataviam territory, or north up the coast into Chumash territory, you'll be in Indian country. And wherever you go in this entire hemisphere, from the Arctic Ocean to the very tip of Patagonia, you will be in someone's ancient homeland. Just want you to think about that. The ceremony continued until just before dawn. Illuminated by a central fire, the dancers moved together and swayed in ancient rhythms. The women's clamshell necklaces, as you see pictured here, clicking softly against their beaded seashell dresses. Between them, supporting them as the women danced in their heavy regalia, were male dancers, dressed as foxes, hunters, and birds. Between songs, the singers lifted up their voices heavenward in the ancient formulas of knee dash, or the feather dance. This was a ceremony to give thanks not only for the creation of the world in which we live, but also for its continuous renewal in each emerging moment. Finally, the celebrants stopped and walked away from the fire and the dance grounds arm in arm. They made their way through small round doorways into snug redwood houses with 4 walls and peaked roofs, the kind of houses in shape that today dot the Northwest California coast. Inside, they bedded down next to kith and kin and other visiting indigenous people who had come to celebrate Nidash with them. And they fell asleep, unaware that less than 8 miles away, a group of men were making plans to kill them. California's Coast Rangers and Klamath Mounted Rangers had been well armed by the governor of the state of California. He had, in the previous 6 months, provided them with 20 muskets, 95 rifles, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. These militiamen now prepared to do one thing and one thing only: kill California Indian people. In the pre-dawn hours of December 31st, 1854, as many as 116 California state militiamen, accompanied by an unknown number of volunteer auxiliaries, stealthily surrounded the village, taking up concealed positions behind boulders and in the brush. At daybreak, as the sky turned pink and orange, men, women, and children emerged from those redwood houses to begin their day. And as they did so, the militiamen and auxiliaries opened fire. They fired, said one eyewitness participant, just as fast as they could reload their weapons. Possessing only 3 guns, the Tolowa and their Indian guests were unable to adequately defend themselves. A few plunged into the nearby waters of Lake Earl, but as they swam across the lake seeking safety on the opposite shore, they became the targets of sharpshooters, marksmen who had been chosen and placed in concealment to shoot people who tried to escape across the lake. When the shooting stopped and the screaming ceased, perhaps hundreds of California Indian people were dead. Not more than 5 individuals seemed to have survived. The attackers apparently suffered but a single casualty, and the state of California later paid them for their work. Between the years 1846 and 1870, as you can see here, California's indigenous population plummeted from at least 150,000 people to not more than 30 or 35,000. Diseases, dislocation, exposure, and starvation all played important roles in this demographic catastrophe. However, abduction, unfree labor, mass death on federal Indian reservations, homicides, battles, and hundreds of massacres also caused the loss of thousands of lives while hindering biological reproduction. This was, in fact, a case of genocide. This is the definition of genocide that I use in this book. This is the international legal definition of genocide. For a prosecutor in an international court of law to successfully convict a defendant of the crime of genocide, they must prove 2 things. First, they must prove, beyond any reasonable shadow of a doubt, that the defendant demonstrated intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, racial, ethnical, or religious group as such. Second, the prosecutor must demonstrate that the defendant committed one of the 5 genocidal acts enumerated here. The convention provides us with a clear and internationally recognized rubric by which to evaluate potential instances of genocide, including historical cases of genocide not subject to legal jurisdiction. Following the formulation of this new international legal treaty, scholars began carefully re-examining the invasion, conquest, and colonization of the state in which we live. And by the year 2000, more than 20 of these scholars had deemed what happened in California between 1846 and 1873 to indeed have been a case of genocide. Still, very little has been written about this genocide compared to some of the more canonical events in human history that we think of as genocide: the Holocaust, Rwanda, Cambodia, and the like. Building on the work of previous scholars, including archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians, this book, An American Genocide, is the first comprehensive year-by-year, month-by-month, week-by-week recounting of the state-sponsored mass murder program that emerged in California during these years. Why write such a big book? Steve held it up. It's nearly 700 pages. It took me 10 years of my life to write. Because this topic calls for meticulous attention to detail. Because the stakes are so high, not only for scholars like those of us who teach and research in colleges, universities, and schools around the nation, but also for California Indian people and really for all United States citizens and everyone who spends time here in this place. Why? Because if United States citizens colonized some regions of California, if not the state as a whole, based upon deliberate attempts to physically annihilate California Indian people, we need to address some really fundamental axioms that inform how we think about the history of this state. Scholars could, for example, re-examine the assumption that indirect effects of colonization, such as the spread of epidemic diseases, rather than the direct effects of colonization, like mass murder, were the leading cause of death in each and every encounter. Exceptionalist interpretations of United States history, which are quite popular, as you know, in our country, also lose validity as we begin to compare the events that took place here in California with other genocides in other times and places around the world. A careful study of genocide here in California can also assist scholars in examining the larger hemispheric population catastrophe. Where scholars document a genocide, it then becomes necessary to carefully evaluate what roles governments played and private individuals, as well as whether or not isolated instances of mass murder were part of a regional or recurring national pattern. Larger questions then follow. What tends to catalyze these kinds of genocides? Who ordered the killing? Who got their hands covered with blood doing the killing? Why do we not know more about these events? Did democracy drive mass murder? And ultimately, what role did genocide play in the making of modern Canada, the United States, Mexico, and the other nations of the Americas? The genocide question, then, is particularly urgent for California's 150,000 California Indian people. Should they press for government apologies, reparations, and control of land where these genocidal events took place? Will tribes marshal evidence of genocide in cases involving tribal sovereignty and federal recognition? How should California Indian communities and governments commemorate the victims of mass murder while simultaneously emphasizing successful accommodation, resistance, and cultural renewal? The psychological issues are also fraught, as I have learned in my many visits to California Indian communities, north and south. What happens when a tribal member learns that she is the descendant of both a genocide perpetrator and a genocide survivor? How might California Indian individuals and communities reconcile increased knowledge of genocide, sometimes at the hands of employees of the United States, with their oftentimes intense patriotism? Finally, what role might increased knowledge of this genocide play in addressing the intergenerational and historical trauma so prevalent in many California Indian communities, and that trauma's direct connection to present-day physical illnesses, psychological disturbances, high rates of homicide, and the highest rate of suicide among youth of any group of people in our state? The question of genocide in California also poses explosive questions for everyone living in the United States. Should government officials tender public apologies, as Presidents Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush did in the 1980s, for the forcible relocation and physical internment of some 120,000 Japanese Americans, many of them citizens of the state of California, during the Second World War? Should federal officials offer monetary compensation along the lines of the more than $1.6 billion that Congress has now paid out to 82,210 of these Japanese Americans and their heirs? Might California officials decrease their cut of California Indians' $7.3 billion a year in annual gaming revenues as a way of offering monetary compensation for the state's direct involvement in this genocide? A better understanding of the genocide that took place here in California might also impact the federal government's dealings with the scores of California Indian communities currently seeking official recognition by the Bureau of Indian Affairs and Congress. The question of commemoration is then closely linked. Will non-Indian people support or even tolerate the public commemoration of mass murders committed by some of this state's Anglo forefathers with the same kinds of monuments, museums, and public days of remembrance that today commemorate, for example, the Armenian genocide or the Holocaust? Will genocides against California Indian people join these mass murders in our public school curricula or in our public discourse? These questions are important, but can only be addressed in limited ways without a comprehensive understanding of the violent relationship between newcomers and native people in this state during the years 1846 to 1873. Sporadic mass killings of California Indian people punctuated the initial years of U.S. rule here, but it was James Marshall's 1848 gold strike in the hills east of Sacramento that precipitated a local genocide. Oregon men coming south in search of California's glittering possibilities played a leading role in increasing this violence against indigenous people. They rarely had connections to California's Hispanic society, in which California Indian people played important roles. And many of these Oregonians saw California Indians as little more than dangerous obstacles to the rapid acquisition of gold. In 1849, Oregonian attacks on California Indian people increased in both frequency and lethality, particularly in the central mines, which were then booming. The central mines are this area here from Sacramento north. One 49er explained in his journal, and I quote, "Oregon people had been used to shooting Indians, and in California they did shoot them freely," end quote. That April, one miner entered the epicenter of this local genocide, Coloma, at Sutter's Mill, where Marshall had first found gold. In the central mines, he and others recounted multiple massacres, the scalping of Indian people, men and women, beheadings, and the slayings of surrendered California Indian civilians. Now, due to spotty primary source coverage, there were not yet any newspapers being published in the mines. We will never know the precise number of California Indian people who suffered violent deaths there in 1849 and early 1850, but hundreds, if not thousands, likely suffered murder. What was clear to observers writing at the time was the exterminatory nature of these killings, both in their intent and in their impact. In December of 1849, Pomo and Wapo people Indians held as unfree laborers on the shores of Clear Lake, north of the San Francisco Bay, rose up and killed their 2 white captors. In response to this double homicide, vigilantes and United States Army soldiers killed as many as 1,000 California Indians, if not more, between Christmas 1849 and May 15, 1850. Vigilantes first murdered and massacred large numbers of California Indian ranch hands and farm workers in the Napa and Sonoma valleys. Then, after authorities arrested 8 of these vigilantes, California's Supreme Court, in its very first case, let all 8 men go on bail and never tried them in court. Meanwhile, the United States Army also sought to avenge the deaths of the 2 white ranchers. In a San Francisco newspaper article headlined, "Horrible Slaughter of Indians," one journalist described a massacre committed by the United States Army on the shores of Clear Lake, using information provided directly by an Army captain, and I quote, "Little or no resistance was encountered, and the work of butchery was of short duration. Neither sex nor age was spared. It was the order of extermination, fearfully obeyed," end quote. As many as 800 California Indian people, mainly women and children, died that morning. Other killings followed, and rather than censuring the officers involved, command promoted all of them. 3 of them became major generals in the United States Army. One of them later became the governor of the state of California. A new factor was at work: large-scale extended vigilante and U.S. Army killing campaigns tolerated by both state and federal authorities. As the gold rush continued, immigrants surged into the state. In 1846, there were not more than 14,000 non-Indian people living in the entire state of California. But as you can see from this slide here, by the year 1860, that number had soared to over 360,000 individuals. These newcomers came primarily in search of wealth. That was the driving motive for them to immigrate around the world to California. But in seeking to access gold, eat, acquire labor, dress, and satisfy their sexual desires, they placed immense pressures on California Indian communities. These demands triggered an explosion in ranching, commercial hunting, mining, and slave raiding. And these activities that generated shockwaves that tore California Indian communities apart. California's new leaders then magnified that impact. Under martial law, the United States military officers in charge of governing California made California Indian people into second-class subjects with few or no rights. California's 1849 Constitution, created and signed in this building, which you can still visit in Monterey, it's Colton Hall Museum. Those men then made it nearly impossible for California Indians, or any Indians for that matter, to vote in California. And in 1850, California's very first elected legislature banned all Indians from voting, barred Indians with 1/2 or more of Indian blood from giving evidence for or against whites, and banned Indians from serving as jurors. Soon thereafter, they barred all Indians from serving or working as attorneys. In fact, the first California Indian person to pass the bar in California did so in the year of my birth, 1971. Now, in combination, these laws, passed in rapid succession, largely shut California Indian people out of participation in and protection by the state's legal system. And abduction played a major role in the California Indian population decline. In the year 1850, the legislature passed an Act for the Government and Protection of Indians. Rarely has a law been so misnamed. This law legalized white custody of Indian minors as well as Indian prisoner leasing, while allowing courts and juries to summarily reject any testimony provided by an Indian person. California Indian people could thus be forced into unpaid work on trumped-up charges. This is a document that comes from our region of the state. This is something that I found in the Bancroft Library at UC Berkeley. This is, if you're too far away to read it, I'll read it for you. It says in French up there, 16-year-old Southern California Indian female at the price of a pound of gunpowder and a bottle of brandy. So this is a broadsheet advertising a slave for sale. In 1860, California legislators extended that 1850 Act to legalize the indenture of any Indian. In combination, these laws triggered a boom in slave raiding and kidnappings while separating women and men during peak reproductive years, both of which accelerated California Indian population decline. And some Indian people were treated as disposable laborers. One LA lawyer recalled, and I quote, "Los Angeles had its slave mart, and thousands of honest and useful people were absolutely destroyed in this way. In fact, between 1850 and 1870, our city's Indian population plunged from 3,693 to just 219. Escape was one way that California Indian people defied servitude, but whites often responded to escape with lethal force. The Lasik Wailaki woman, Lucy Young, who we see pictured here in her later years, escaped servitude multiple times, and she provides us with a window on the experience. She recollected, and I quote, "Young woman been stole by white people, come back, shot through lights and liver. Front skin hang down like apron. She tie up with cotton dress, never die neither." Others were less fortunate. After one California Indian woman fled her, quote, "lord and master" with his Indian boy in 1858, white vigilantes responded by massacring an entire village of 15 individuals. 2 years later, a rancher on the Van Dusen River became so incensed when his 7-year-old Indian servant went half a mile away to visit his family that he, quote, "slaughtered the whole family of 6 persons, boy and all," end quote. Now, lest you think that all of this material is coming from some never-seen-before journals and letters squirreled away in a vault at the Huntington, most of the reports that I'm sharing with you this evening are published in newspapers. They come from the Los Angeles Star, from the San Francisco Daily Alta California, and the like. So despite these reports, policymakers failed to intervene, while almost all law enforcement officials turned a blind eye. The United States Congress, meanwhile, made California Indian people particularly vulnerable to immigration's blast. In 1851 and 1852, federal treaty agents, they're the 3 men whom you see here in this portrait, signed 18 separate treaties with 119 California Indian communities, allocating them 7,488,000 acres. And we can see that area, those are the gray areas surrounded by white on this map. Those were going to be California's federal Indian reservations. But meeting in a secret session, United States senators in Washington, D.C. unanimously repudiated all of these treaties. Instead, in 1853, Congress authorized 5 temporary military reservations not to exceed 25,000 acres each. And crucially, they conferred no land titles or legal recognition on California's indigenous communities. The results were fourfold. First, no reservations were patented, and jurisdiction over them was left uncertain. Second, because jurisdiction remained uncertain, confusion and conflict between and among state and federal authorities prevailed. It was never entirely clear who had jurisdiction on these temporary reservations. Third, and this is also very important, California Indian people did not become the explicit legal wards of the federal government. Finally, United States Army Major General John Wool's 1857 interpretation of these reservations' legal status denied them full protection by the United States Army. And I quote, "Until these reservations are perfected, the United States troops have no right to exclude whites from trespassing on the reservations or even to prevent them from kidnapping Indian women and children there." Federal officials thus made California Indian people particularly vulnerable, not only to kidnapping and slavery, but to rape, assault, homicide, and mass murder. The establishment of California's state militia system now marked the rise of a killing machine. Between the years 1850 and 1861, 3,414 volunteer state militiamen participated in 25 separate militia campaigns against California Indian people, killing at least 1,342 of them. However, the impact of these volunteer state militia operations transcended these numbers. Militiamen served as a widely publicized state endorsement of Indian killing, communicating to the public an unofficial grant of legal impunity for Indian killing and inspiring many more vigilantes to kill. Indeed, vigilantes killed at a minimum 6,400 California Indian people during these years. So were these people rogue operators? No, they were not. In January of 1851, California Governor Peter Burnett declared, and I quote, "that a war of extermination will continue to be waged until the Indian race becomes extinct." The following month, state legislators voted to borrow $500,000, an extraordinary amount of money, by far the single largest line item in that year's state budget, for both past and future anti-Indian militia operations. Meanwhile, in San Francisco, the state began building up an arsenal of muskets, rifles, sabers, and ammunition, all donated to them by the United States Army. Then, in May of 1852, the state passed, having run through that first $500,000 very quickly, a $600,000 bond measure to support additional militia operations. Now, we're looking at one of these actual bonds here in this slide. You can see George Washington on the right-hand margin and probably a Haudenosaunee or Iroquois warrior there on the top. What's missing here are the coupons that have been carefully sliced off by a banker as the investor turns in the coupons for their 7.5% guaranteed interest. The Sinkyone woman, Sally Bell, pictured here as an elder, provides us with a rare California Indian eyewitness account of a massacre that she survived in the 1850s somewhere in the northwest coast. Bell remembered, and I quote, "About 10 o'clock in the morning, some white men came. They killed my grandfather and my mother and my father. I saw them do it. Then they killed my baby sister, and they cut her heart out, and they threw it into the bushes. where I had run to hide. My little sister was a baby, just crawling around. I did not know what to do. I was so scared that I guess I just hid there for a long time with my little sister's heart in my hands. It was a terrifying time to be a California Indian. The United States Congress now endorsed such killings. In 1854, the United States Congress allocated over $924,000 to reimburse the state of California for its past expenditures on militia campaigns against Indians. State Quartermaster and Adjutant General William Kibbe, pictured here, wrote a tactical manual and distributed it to his officers. That Christmas, Jefferson C. Davis, then the Secretary of War of the United States, sent a crate of tactical manuals from the Army to be distributed to California militia officers. And in the year 1857, having run out of money again, state legislators appropriated an additional $410,000 for more militia campaigns with predictable results. Finally, in the year 1861, even as southern states were seceding, Congress appropriated another $400,000 to pay California for its militia expenses. Civilians and officials throughout this period often carried out large-scale forced removal operations intent on relocating California Indian people to those temporary military reservations. And these forced removals were often lethal. For example, in April of 1856, vigilantes massacred 55 California Indians while forcibly removing one community to the Mendocino Reservation. The Lake Yakuts woman Yoymut recollected that during the forced removal of her people to the Fresno Reservation, soldiers first killed 10 Indians. 10 others died along the way. Likewise, the Nome Lackey man Andrew Freeman recollected that when they took my Indian people to the Round Valley Reservation, they drove them like stock, and they shot the old people who could not make the trip. They would shoot children who were getting tired. Once at reservations, California Indian people often encountered institutionalized malnutrition and outright starvation. The Concow leader Tomayanem recollected that after volunteers had forcibly removed his community to the Mendocino Reservation, and I quote, "We were very hungry, and the Concows began to die very fast." Other reservations proved little better. In about 1860, Tomayanem and his people relocated south to the Round Valley Reservation in search of food, but they found that here there was even less to eat. Indeed, in 1860, officials typically provided 480 to 910 calories per day to working Round Valley Reservation inmates. And by 1862, the daily rations there had plummeted to 160 to 390 calories per person per day. If some California reservation inmates died of outright starvation, malnutrition dramatically suppressed the immune systems of many others, making them susceptible to the lethal diseases so prevalent on these reservations. Starvation and malnutrition also predictably depressed fecundity while increasing the number of miscarriages and stillbirths. Some reservation officials and colonists living on reservations also treated California Indian people there as disposable laborers with lethal results. According to one colonist testifying before a martial tribunal on the reservation, and I quote, "About 300 died at the Round Valley Indian Reservation during the winter of 1856 to 1857 from the effects of packing them through the mountains in the snow and mud. They were generally worked naked and packed 50 pounds if able. At California's reservations, willful neglect took an untold number of lives." Federal employees also killed California Indian people in more direct ways. During the United States Civil War, 15,725 California men volunteered for the Union Army. Thousands of those volunteers remained in California, and they soon radically transformed California's killing machine. As U.S. troops, these so-called California volunteers replaced relatively small, short-term militia campaigns with much longer, much larger army campaigns. Vigilante operations flourished alongside them, but the genocide was now primarily a federal project. And U.S. forces killed substantial numbers. The very first California Volunteers campaign in Northwest California killed 120 California Indian people in a few weeks. Hundreds more would die in succeeding operations led by officers like this man, the West Point-trained Henry M. Black. Cavalry Captain Moses McLaughlin proudly reported how in 1863, and I quote, "I had all the bucks together, and 35 were either shot or sabred. None escaped." McLaughlin concluded, "They will soon all be absolutely killed off or driven so far into the waterless wastes that they will perish by absolute thirst." The U.S. Army continued killing California Indians in a succession of campaigns into the late 1860s. And even after officers concluded their last large-scale operation against California Indians in the 1872-1873 Modoc War, they hanged and beheaded 4 Modoc leaders who had voluntarily surrendered before shipping their severed heads to a collection in Washington, D.C. The California Indian catastrophe fits the 2-part legal definition set forth in the 1948 United Nations Genocide Convention. First, perpetrators articulated, both in word and in deed, their intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. And second, they committed all 5 of the genocidal acts enumerated. Killing occurred in more than 370 separate massacres throughout the state, as well as hundreds and hundreds of smaller killings, homicides, and executions. Sources indicate that in total, between 1846 and 1873, vigilantes, militiamen, and United States Army soldiers killed at least 9,492 to 16,094 California Indian people, and probably many more. These are quite conservative numbers. By way of contrast, California Indian people killed fewer than 1,500 non-Indians during this same period. Other acts of genocide proliferated too. Many rapes and beatings occurred, and these meet the convention's definition of causing serious bodily harm to victims on the basis of their group identity and with the intent to physically destroy the group. The sustained military and civilian policy of routinely demolishing and setting fire to California Indian villages while driving survivors into inhospitable desert and alpine regions amounted to deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction in whole or in part. And some Office of Indian Affairs employees administering federal Indian reservations in California committed the same genocidal crime. Further, because malnutrition and exposure predictably lowered fertility, this is something that reservation administrators routinely commented on, while increasing the number of miscarriages and stillbirths, some state and federal decision makers also appear guilty of imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Finally, the state of California, kidnappers, and federal officials were all involved in forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. In fact, between 1850 and 1863 alone, 3,000 to 4,000 or more California Indian children suffered such forced removals. By breaking up families and shattering whole communities, forced removals also constituted imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Sufficient evidence then exists to designate the California Indian catastrophe a case of genocide, according to the UN Convention. Elected California officials were the primary architects of annihilation. Legislators created and legislated a legal environment in which California Indian people had almost no rights, thus granting those who attacked them virtual legal impunity. Moreover, 2 different elected governors threatened total physical annihilation, and both governors and elected officials cooperated in building a killing machine. California governors called out or authorized no fewer than 24 militia expeditions, which killed a minimum of 1,342 California Indian people. And state legislators also raised over $1.5 million to fund these lethal operations. Finally, in 1863, after the United States Army had taken over the killing machine, the state legislature passed a bill to raise $600,000 more to encourage white men in California to join the Union Army. Yet the state of California did not and could not have acted alone. The U.S. Army played a crucial role in this genocide, first creating the exclusionary legal system, then setting genocidal precedents, helping to build the killing machine, participating directly in the killing, and finally taking outright control of it. In total, U.S. soldiers killed at least 1,688 to 3,741 California Indian people during this time. If state legislators were the primary architects of the genocide, federal officials helped to lay the groundwork, became the final arbiters of the design, and ultimately paid for most of its official execution. By the year 1863, Congress had transferred to the government of California more than $1 million in reimbursement money for those past militia operations. Federal legislators paid for some or all of the many lethal campaigns against California Indians. Like California's indigenous people, Native Americans throughout the nation suffered a devastating population collapse following the invasion of newcomers. Before arrival, perhaps 5 million or more Indian people inhabited what are now the 48 states. By 1900, census takers counted fewer than 250,000 survivors. What caused this catastrophe? Diseases, colonialism, and war all played important roles, but was something more sinister also to blame? Academics and others have long debated whether or not Native Americans or any particular nations of Native people suffered genocide during the conquest and colonization of the Americas. The question of genocide in United States history remains an important subject, given that the near obliteration of this nation's indigenous peoples was and is a formative event in the country's history. As in many other Western Hemisphere states, the Native American population cataclysm played a foundational role in facilitating the conquest and colonization of millions of square miles, the real estate and the vast cornucopia of natural resources upon which the richest and most powerful nation in the world was built. So how we understand the Native American population cataclysm in our country directly shapes how we understand the origin and making of it. Beyond interpretations of U.S. history, the stakes include issues like public acknowledgement, apology, reparations, control of natural resources, vast swaths of land, American Indian sovereignty, and ultimately, our national character. Despite these high stakes, the question remains largely unresolved. 2 factors polarize the debate over the question of genocide in the Americas. First, only some participants use the UN Genocide Convention as their definition, even though 147 countries are now party to it. A growing body of international case law supports it, and it remains the only authoritative international legal definition. You could see where I stand on this, right? Just as important, many participants emphasize rendering a verdict of genocide or not genocide for the entire history of the United States, both before and after 1776, or sometimes the entire Western Hemisphere from 1492 into the very present moment in which we sit together. Across the United States, though, indigenous population declines took place at different rates, over millions of square miles, and across centuries. Colonial, state, and federal policy-making personnel changed over time, as did their government's policies toward indigenous peoples. Moreover, thousands of different indigenous communities were involved. Their resistance and accommodation strategies varied dramatically, and they changed over time. Thus, despite the many published histories of violence against indigenous peoples, the details revealed by this California case suggest the need for more local and regional case studies to provide the data that will ultimately permit an assessment of genocide's frequency, occurrence, and variability in other regions in the United States as a whole and elsewhere in the Americas, from Patagonia all the way to the Arctic. Assessing the question of genocide in the United States and beyond without an agreed-upon definition and robust case studies makes it very difficult to reach comprehensive conclusions. The direct and deliberate killing of Indian people in California between 1846 and 1873 was more lethal and sustained than anywhere else in the history of the United States or its colonial antecedents. Yet there remains a need for additional detailed case studies addressing other times and regions. The variables present in California did not recur in precisely the same combination or at the same intensities in the histories of all Native American peoples. In some other cases, disease, we know, was the overwhelming cause of mortalities. Both state and federal or colonial and metropolitan decision makers were not complicit in every case. Other Native American peoples employed different survival and resistance strategies, for example, fleeing or migrating away from contact zones or killing much larger numbers of colonizers. Finally, in other cases, colonizers may have committed fewer or no genocidal crimes at all, while the causes and rates of death varied. We need to build on our existing knowledge with new research in order to better understand the full picture for the United States, North America, and the Western Hemisphere. But I hope that this book presents a workable methodology for potential cases of genocide in the Americas and beyond. The UN Genocide Convention provides historians with a standardized, internationally recognized rubric and a coherent legal definition that may be consistently applied. Scholars should rigorously consider each potential case of genocide in consistent terms. Just as important, we should consider each on a case-by-case or region-by-region basis, not just in California, but nationwide and internationally, to create a scholarly precision in our use of what is undoubtedly a politically explosive term, and to seriously evaluate the balance between variables like the 5 genocidal crimes enumerated in the Convention and other factors. Detailed case studies are an important element of genocide studies because case studies provide a powerful tool with which not only to understand genocide in the past, but to combat its denial and to prevent its repetition in the future. Native American people experienced and responded to conquest and colonization in a wide variety of ways. Rigorously examining this range of cases using the Genocide Convention to evaluate both genocidal intent and genocidal acts will help to move the question of genocide in the United States and in the Americas toward clarity. Unbraiding each region's story from the tapestry of American Indian history and bringing each into sharper relief will create a clearer, more vivid portrait of Native American experiences and of Western Hemisphere history as a whole. Such investigations will be painful, but they will help all Americans, both Native Americans and non-Indians, to make more accurate sense of our past and ourselves. Thank you.